Think of the Middle Ages, and what image springs to mind? Shining knights galloping to rescue maidens locked away in towers, troubadours singing heartfelt ballads beneath castle windows, a world of romance that seems like the first draft of our modern fairy tales. But that illusion begins to crumble the moment you peel back the glittering surface. The reality of medieval love was darker, stranger, and at times so disturbing that even our worst modern dating nightmares pale in comparison. What movies have taught us to see as courtly, noble, or romantic was often a system of manipulation, ownership, and suffering, carefully designed to maintain power and status rather than nurture affection. Take the curious invention of courtly love. It sounds poetic, even beautiful, but in practice it was closer to an elaborate game of emotional self-destruction. A knight, typically bound by duty and loyalty, might fixate on a woman he could never have, usually the wife of a nobleman. Instead of moving on or finding real companionship, he was expected to dedicate his life to worshipping her from afar. Poems poured out of his anguish, songs celebrated his torment, and battles were fought in her honor. This wasn't considered foolish or pathetic. It was idealized. In fact, suffering was the point. Medieval troubadours insisted that true love could not exist without pain, rejection, and endless longing. Happiness was suspect. Misery was noble. To modern ears, it sounds like a medieval manual for cultivating anxiety and obsession. The rules were merciless. A true lover must lose sleep, appetite, and reason over his beloved. If she offered him kindness, he was expected to feel greater torment. If she ignored him, her virtue was proven. Women, for their part, were trapped in equally cruel expectations. They were required to remain cold and distant. To show affection would be to cheapen themselves. So both men and women were locked into performances of misery, their emotions bent into grotesque shapes by social norms. Yet this wasn't merely poetry confined to manuscripts, it shaped real relationships among the nobility. Behind the pageantry of banquets and tournaments, men and women enacted this theater of longing and rejection. Imagine entire lifetimes spent in carefully orchestrated sorrow, where the highest proof of your nobility was your ability to suffer gracefully for love you could never possess. But what of marriage? If courtly love was emotional torment, marriage was cold commerce. Forget roses, whispered vows, or the search for a soulmate. Medieval marriages were business mergers dressed in ritual. Children as young as 7 were bound in contracts that carried financial penalties if broken. These agreements had little to do with the well-being of the bride or groom, and everything to do with the size of the dowry, the strength of alliances, or the expansion of land holdings. A daughter was not asked whom she wished to marry. She was assessed like an asset: how many acres, how many cattle, how many coins she might bring. The dowry system reduced women to walking price tags. A father might negotiate his daughter's marriage in the same tone he used to haggle over livestock. 3 cows, 50 acres, and my daughter in exchange for your youngest son. Such transactions were hardly caricatures, but rather the blunt reality. Once the deal was struck, there was little room for protest. Marriage contracts detailed not only the transfer of property, but also the consequences if the bride failed in her duties, particularly in producing heirs. If she bore no sons, she could be discarded, returned like faulty goods. The cruelty extended to age. Many child brides, barely out of childhood themselves, were sent away to foreign households, sometimes across borders, to live among strangers who saw them as valuable breeding stock or political insurance. They might never see their families again. A 12-year-old girl leaving home in tears for a strange land was not seen as a tragedy, but as the natural order of things. Even love itself was regarded with suspicion in such arrangements. If 2 young people wished to marry each other out of affection, families questioned their motives. A union born of desire rather than calculation seemed dangerous, even irrational, because it placed emotion above profit. Behind the ornate churches, the feasting halls, and the splendid clothing of the medieval elite, marriage functioned less as a personal union and more as an elaborate system of property exchange. Love, if it existed at all, was accidental, something that slipped through the cracks of a rigidly controlled society. For most, the best they could hope for was endurance, not happiness. So much for fairy tales. When we peer into the medieval world of love and marriage, what we find is not a golden age of romance, but a carefully constructed machine that traded in misery, duty, and commerce. Love was seldom the goal. In fact, more often than not, it was seen as a dangerous distraction. If marriage was a marketplace, the church made sure that even the private sphere of intimacy was suffused with guilt, fear, and regulation. In the medieval Christian worldview, pleasure was not a blessing, but a trap. Sexual desire, they insisted, was the devil whispering through your veins, and the holiest life was one stripped of passion altogether. Celibacy was considered the highest calling, marriage only a grudging concession for those too weak to resist temptation. To modern eyes, the church's teachings read like a handbook of psychological warfare. Couples were told that sex within marriage was permissible only if approached with the same attitude as swallowing bitter medicine, necessary, quick, and never enjoyed. To feel pleasure was to sin even when trying to conceive. A strange calendar of restrictions made intimacy nearly impossible. No sex on Sundays, holy days, Lent, Advent, Fridays, Saturdays, or during pregnancy, menstruation, and breastfeeding. When the days were tallied, only about 40 per year remained when a couple might lawfully share a bed. The theology behind this was chilling. Priests taught that before the fall, Adam and Eve reproduced without desire, without pleasure, as naturally as plants releasing pollen. The fact that sex felt good was proof that humankind had been corrupted. Women bore the heaviest burden of this logic. They were painted as inherently more lustful, more dangerous, the very snares of Satan sent to drag men into damnation. A woman's beauty was not celebrated but feared. Her body was thought of as a battlefield where the devil waged war against men's souls. Within this framework, marriage was not a celebration of love but a containment system, a way to control human desire before it tore society apart. The highest ideal was still celibacy, and those who chose to marry were seen as spiritually weaker, their union tolerated rather than admired. It is hard not to wonder how many men and women internalize this teaching, carrying shame for every natural impulse, convinced that their own bodies were their greatest enemies. But repression did not erase passion, it only twisted it. And so, in the strange logic of medieval society, the language of love was often expressed not through tenderness, but through violence. What we might call stalking or assault today was celebrated as romance. Tales of knights abducting women, sweeping them away against their will, filled medieval literature, and these stories were not cautionary, but aspirational. To seize a woman by force proved the depth of a man's devotion. Her feelings, her choice, were almost irrelevant. Tournaments, those dazzling spectacles of clashing steel and galloping horses, were not only about martial skill or glory, they were rituals of courtship. Men battered one another to pulp before cheering crowds, and women were expected to swoon at the sight. The more brutal the contest, the more romantic the gesture became. In this world, love was measured in broken bones and blood spilled. A gentleman, one who approached a woman with kindness, was portrayed as weak, unattractive, almost laughable, hardly fit to inspire devotion. It is difficult to overstate how deeply normalized this was. Stories praised knights who risked death for a woman's hand, who fought duels or even ignited wars in the name of love. Brutality was not an unfortunate side effect of romance, it was the very proof of it. A man unwilling to risk everything, even life itself, was not considered serious about his feelings. Even darker was the infamous claim of droit du seigneur, the so-called right of the first night, in which feudal lords demanded access to newly married brides. Historians debate how widely this practice was enforced, but whether real or exaggerated, the legend itself reveals how power and sexuality were bound together. It was presented as a test. Would the husband fight to defend his wife's honor? If not, he was deemed unworthy. Imagine the terror of a wedding night shadowed by the possibility of violence sanctioned by law and tradition. In this twisted culture, women were conditioned to find aggression desirable, even admirable. Literature, music, and ritual all reinforced the same narrative. The man who conquered was noble, the man who pleaded was pathetic. Love was not a meeting of equals, but a battle in which one dominated and the other submitted. And so when we strip away the romantic gloss that centuries of storytelling have painted over the Middle Ages, what emerges is unsettling. Desire was demonized, pleasure condemned, and affection often replaced by ritualized violence. This was not the love of fairy tales, or even of flawed modern romances. It was a system where devotion was proven through conquest, where the body was policed by religion, and where women's agency was erased in the name of chivalry. By now, it should be clear that medieval romance was not built on affection, but on systems of power. Nowhere is this more visible than in the way women were regarded, not as individuals, but as possessions to be won, exchanged, or defended like property. Consider the language of the age. Men did not simply marry women, they claimed them, won them, or took them. Women were treated as prizes in the tournaments that filled noble calendars, alongside gold cups and fine horses. A knight who triumphed in combat might be rewarded with a woman as though she were a trophy to display. Far from being scandalized, society expected women to be grateful for such an honor, to smile and accept their new role as spoils of a man's victory. The legal codes of the time reinforced this view. Adultery was not defined as a betrayal of trust or love, but as theft. A woman who strayed was not seen as making her own choice. She was treated as stolen property. A cow wandered into another man's pasture. The punishment fell less on her desire than on the offense against her husband's ownership. And in war, the same logic extended with horrifying consequences. Capturing women from rival lands was not only common, but celebrated. Stories of abducted women falling in love with their captors became a staple of medieval literature, romanticizing trauma and justifying violence with the language of destiny. Under law, a woman's identity scarcely existed apart from the men who controlled her. As a daughter, she was her father's possession. Upon marriage, she became her husband's. She could not own property, draft contracts, or testify in court without male permission. In effect, she was invisible in the eyes of the law, her existence defined only through the men around her. Love, as we imagine it, required choice, freedom, and equality. In medieval Europe, those concepts were denied to half the population. Yet despite this grim reality, the age was captivated by stories of tragic romance. Perhaps because true happiness was so elusive, society elevated suffering into an ideal. The most celebrated tales of love, Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, Abelard and Heloise, did not end in harmony, but in disaster. These stories were not warnings, they were models. The message was unmistakable. To love fully was to suffer, to be destroyed, even to die. This obsession went beyond literature. Medieval physicians described lovesickness as a genuine disease, listing symptoms of wasting away, fevers, even death caused by unfulfilled passion. Treatments ranged from herbal tonics to bloodletting, or even exorcism. For many believed that such passion was the devil's work. To die of heartbreak was considered not only possible, but noble, the mark of a true lover. The ideal of death before dishonor permeated the imagination of the time. Lovers who killed themselves rather than live apart were hailed as heroes. Romeo and Juliet, often thought of as Shakespeare's invention, was simply a Renaissance retelling of a medieval formula already centuries old. In this logic, living together in peace was pedestrian, but dying together in agony was transcendent. What emerges from this worldview is startling. Medieval romance was not a celebration of joy or companionship, but a theater of misery. Women were reduced to prizes and pawns. Men proved devotion through violence and conquest. The church transformed pleasure into sin, turning intimacy into a battlefield of guilt. And when all else failed, death became the ultimate proof of love's intensity. Strip away the myths of chivalry and shining armor, and the medieval idea of love looks less like a fairy tale and more like a nightmare dressed in poetry. For the men and women who lived under its shadow, romance was rarely about happiness. It was about survival within a system where affection was suspect, desire was dangerous, and suffering was the most exalted form of devotion. And yet perhaps the most haunting truth is how much of this legacy lingers. The idea that love must involve suffering, that jealousy and control prove devotion, that violence can be romantic, echoes of medieval thought still reverberate in modern culture. When we idolize tragic romances, when we mistake obsession for passion, we are, in some ways, repeating patterns written centuries ago. The Middle Ages remind us that myths are powerful. They shape not only how people tell stories, but how they live their lives. And in this case, the myth of medieval love gave birth to centuries of anguish, leaving behind a legacy both alluring and unsettling. A reminder that sometimes what glitters in history is not gold, but chains. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If this journey into the dark side of medieval love surprised you, or even gave you chills, don't forget to give us a like to support the channel. And make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming stories as we continue uncovering the strange, hidden, and fascinating corners of human history. Every like, comment, and subscription means the world to us. It's what keeps us motivated to bring you even more powerful stories. See you in the next episode.